On the morning of December 1st, 1948, the Australian coastline was entering another humid summer. The world was still recovering from the Second World War, and Somerton Beach, just outside Adelaide, was a quiet, familiar place for locals to exercise horses or take a morning walk. But that morning, two riders found a man sitting slumped against the seawall. His legs were crossed, a half-smoked cigarette rested on his collar, and he appeared to be asleep. He was actually completely unresponsive. When police arrived to investigate, they realized he carried absolutely no wallet, no keys, or identification. The effort to erase who this man was went far beyond emptying his pockets. Every manufacturer tag and clothing label on his suit, his shirt, and his trousers had been meticulously, surgically cut out with a pair of scissors. Most cold cases go unsolved because there simply isn't enough evidence to follow. This case is entirely different. The police found an overwhelming amount of physical material, but every finding they uncovered directly contradicted the logic of the one before it. Over the next 7 decades, 3 distinct waves of information would emerge. Instead of closing the file, each discovery pulled his true nature further out of reach. For 6 solid months, the Adelaide police had nothing. They circulated his description, checked missing persons reports, and combed the city, but the trail was completely dead. Then, a pathologist re-examining the dead man's trousers noticed a faint line of stitching along the waistband. Tucked behind the standard pocket was a secondary, hidden fob pocket, and inside that pocket, tightly rolled up, was a tiny scrap of paper. Printed on that cream-colored scrap were 2 Persian words, Tamam Shud. Translated, the phrase means, "it is finished." A local journalist recognized the phrase as the final words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 12th century book of poetry. After police launched a nationwide public appeal, a man walked into a station with a copy of that exact book. He had found it tossed into the back seat of his unlocked car, parked near the beach around the time the body was discovered. The final page was torn out, and the ragged edge perfectly matched the scrap found on the dead man. The man on the beach was no longer a random victim of circumstance. Ripping the final words from a poem about mortality and sewing them into a hidden pocket meant his death was a highly orchestrated event. When investigators placed the recovered book under an ultraviolet light, they found faint pencil indentations pressed into the back cover. Staring back at them were 5 lines of capitalized, seemingly random letters. It was a cipher, and the format immediately caught the attention of military intelligence because it closely resembled an encryption method used heavily by spies during the Cold War. Analysts suspected it was a one-time pad cipher. This is a mathematical encryption technique where the sender and receiver both possess identical copies of the exact same book. Without that matching physical key, the scrambled letters are completely unbreakable. The book contained one more detail, an unlisted local phone number. It belonged to a 27-year-old nurse who lived just a short walk from where the body was found. When detectives showed her a plaster cast of the dead man's face, witnesses noted she looked completely terrified and appeared ready to faint. Yet she adamantly denied ever meeting him. By tracing the book, the investigation fractured. The search for a missing person was entangled with a terrified witness, complex military-grade encryption, and the possibility of an international espionage operation. The cipher remained uncracked, and the body remained nameless for 73 years. Then, modern researchers turned to a few strands of hair that had been caught in the man's plaster death mask to extract mitochondrial DNA. Cross-referencing that genetic profile with public family trees, genealogists finally put a legal name to the mysterious body on the beach. He was Carl Webb. Records showed Webb was a 43-year-old electrical engineer from Melbourne. He had vanished from the public record a year before his death, right around the time his wife had filed for divorce. This background suggested a terribly ordinary conclusion. Webb was a heartbroken man who traveled to Adelaide to track down his estranged wife. When he failed, he went to a quiet beach at dawn, consumed an untraceable poison, and left a poetic suicide note. DNA testing provided the biological answer of who Carl Webb was, But applying that mundane identity to the events of 1948 requires ignoring the most baffling physical evidence found on the beach. If Webb was simply a depressed engineer ending his own life, there is no logical reason for him to meticulously cut every manufacturer's label out of his clothing before doing so. And the theory of a lonely, isolated death doesn't explain the local nurse. Why did she nearly collapse when she saw his face? Decades later, her daughter recounted how her mother admitted to speaking Russian and claimed her connection to the man was a matter of state-level secrecy, a claim that suggests a version of Carl Webb that never appeared in his Melbourne marriage records. Then there is the code. A depressed civilian with no intelligence training does not accidentally generate 5 lines of complex encryption that completely stumps Australian naval intelligence. And finally, there is the grave. For 25 years after Carl Webb was sealed under concrete in an unmarked plot, an unknown person continued to visit. At odd hours, completely anonymously, fresh white flowers would be placed on the dirt. Modern science is incredibly powerful. It can pull a name from a 70-year-old strand of hair and map out a man's entire family tree. But it cannot decode intent. Carl Webb has his name back, but the reason he ended up on that beach remains completely out of reach.